Hi, my name is Dr. Jennifer Jill Schwirzer, and I'm here to share with you part 4 of the Joy Sessions. It's a series I'm doing for Storyline Church that hopefully will help us incorporate more positive emotion into our day-to-day experience. It's a series on emotional health, basically. And the title of my talk today is Growth Mindset. Now, I want to issue a simple disclaimer here. Growth mindset is used in an academic context a little differently than I'm using it in this presentation. You'll see how I'm using it in a moment. So the subtitle is How the Purpose of Learning to Love and Be Loved Makes Sense of Life. And what that means is that as we grow in love, which as far as I'm concerned and as far as from what I can see in Scripture, God is concerned, the whole point of life is to learn to love and be loved. We were made in His image to love and be loved. He is a God of love, and as we grow in love, we come more and more into our purpose and our calling. So when we learn that the purpose of our lives is to love and be loved, it helps make sense of some of the disappointments we experience. Now, pretty early in my adult life, I coined a term called major life disappointments. Major life disappointments, or MLDs, are things that happen to us that significantly reduce the quality of our lives and make life less attractive to us. I remember meeting a person who had purposed, she had set as a goal for herself to be a classical musician, a violinist. And then early in her experience, she started to experience health and nerve issues that made it impossible for her to engage in fine motor coordination, thus ruining her dream of being a classical musician. I knew something of what it was like for her because I had experienced something similar with my own desire to be a singer. I had some health problems that made it impossible for me to sing on a professional level to the degree that I wanted to. And that was a major life disappointment for me. And sometimes those major life disappointments are the most difficult when they're things that most people don't think are that catastrophic. For instance, saying, I can't play the violin. Someone might say, neither can I, big deal. You say you have cancer, people are going to come around you and offer empathy and sympathy. So sometimes it's the smaller things that really become more difficult to bear because we don't get the social support that we need for the more catastrophic situations. But major life disappointments can severely compromise the quality of our lives on earth. And I want to explore that, and I want to show you how a little shift in our thinking and a little different approach can bring about an entirely different outcome, and we can thrive in spite of these disappointments. The astrophysicist Stephen Hawking experienced one of those major life disappointments. Early in his life, he developed ALS, which is a disease that impacts the fine motor coordination, the nerves that control voluntary movement. And because of that, he would gradually lose the ability to move. This man, nevertheless, was a brilliant man, obviously. He succeeded in writing many books, but a couple of them were A Brief History of Time and The Theory of Everything. Obviously, this guy's an expansive thinker. He wrote those books by being hooked up to a sensor that was moved by a muscle in his cheek, one of the only muscles that was still functioning in his body. And he was able to write those books. An amazing man, an amazing story. But what most people don't know about him is that before he developed ALS, he was really quite a discouraged human being. He drank too much. He was unmotivated in spite of his great talent. He says when one's expectations are reduced to zero, one really appreciates everything that one does have. Notice what he said there. When one's expectations are reduced to zero, one appreciates. Notice the relationship between lowered expectations and greater gratitude. I have a friend who went through a similar catastrophic disappointment. Her name was Pat Arabito, lovely woman, loving mother of 4 children, loving wife to her husband, Jim. Jim and the 2 oldest boys went on a trip one weekend to Alaska, and they were in a small private plane which unfortunately plowed into the side of a mountain, killing both boys and Pat's husband. Can you imagine that phone call? Can you imagine when that news comes to you and you know that literally half of your family is gone? And yet I don't know another human being who is as inspiring as Pat Arabito in the way that she took what was left of her life and carried forward even the dream of her husband, Jim, who had a dream to produce major motion pictures based on biblical truth. And she was able to carry that dream to fruition. Here's what she said about her day-to-day experience after the blow of that death came to her. I just did what was in front of me when the sun came up every morning, hanging on to God for dear life, finding words that fit my need. And he did it. Faithful is he who calls you, who also will do it. Pat has an inspiring faith, and that faith blossomed in the midst of a major life disappointment. You know, we must examine our expectations, for they may set us up for disappointment. Now, I know that sounds kind of harsh, but it really works this way. Like if we have unrealistic expectations, we are going to be disappointed. And if we have unrealistic expectations much of the time, we're going to be disappointed much of the time. We're going to feel powerless and frustrated because our expectations keep being let down. Many believers, I'm talking straight here, trying to help myself and other people by talking straight truth, but many even believers in Jesus struggle because of false expectations of God. I remember a long period of time when I was disappointed with God. I struggled because I felt like the heavens were brass over me when I would pray. He wasn't measuring up to what I thought he would do for me as his child. And those false expectations of God set me up for that disappointment. And I struggled actually more than I had to. Now I'm going to be sharing with you a couple of ideas and skills that will help you not have to go through what I went through in my disappointment with God. When we allow bad or good circumstances to tell us whether or not God loves us, we deprive ourselves of the sense of security in which God wants us to have constant rest. So if we let those disappointments speak for God, we're actually listening to the wrong source of evidence for who God is. And we deprive ourselves of the very support we need to get through those disappointments. So when those disappointments hit, do not think that it is God that is giving that to you, because that'll cut you off from the main individual who is part of your support system. So one of the things that I have learned to do is expand the context in which I can experience joy. In order to expand our joy, in order to incorporate more of these positive emotions into our lives, we have to multiply the context in which we experience those positive emotions. So I think of a friend of mine who really had this expanding capacity thing down pat. His name was Charlie. And Charlie had experienced a major life disappointment in losing the ability to walk when he was only 21 years old. He was jumping on a trampoline that was pushed together with another trampoline, and he fell on the hard part between the trampolines and broke his back. As a result, he was a paraplegic with partial use of his hands, really a quadriplegic of sorts. And yet Charlie, again, was one of the most encouraging people I have ever met in my life. Charlie was very supportive to my dad when he got cancer. My dad respected Charlie, not only because of the things Charlie said, but because of where he said them from. He said them from a wheelchair. And my dad looked at Charlie and thought, man, if he can say that from a wheelchair, then I can brave my way through cancer. And unfortunately, my dad lost his life, but Charlie was a great encouragement to him. Charlie had this expanding capacity thing down pat. His favorite motto was, play at it. Play at it. Play at it meant don't take life so heavy. Don't get so discouraged by the mishaps of life on earth. Now, I remember one particular evening when I encountered such a mishap. I was driving home from my job as an intern when I was in the process of getting my counseling degree. So I had to work for a whole year for free. So finances were tight, things were difficult. I was driving an old car. You know how that goes. And I was driving home one evening, and all of a sudden the car stopped running. You know that experience as well. I pulled over. I was on a country road. It was a warm and beautiful night, but I was extremely discouraged, and I started in on my typical way of handling disappointments. Why does it have to happen now? Of all times, oh God, why can't you just make something where, that whole kind of script that I would so often read off of in my life. And then suddenly I remembered Charlie's words, play at it. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to experiment, and I'm going to approach this situation differently than I normally would. I'm going to play at it, because if there's anyone who can teach me how to do this, it's a man in a wheelchair. So I got out of the car. I called not 911, AAA, and called them and got them in motion. Takes a couple hours to get there usually, but I got out of my car, sat on the roof for a while, started singing. I'm sure people driving by thought I was completely out of my mind, but I was having a good experience. As soon as I chose to be cheerful in the midst of difficulty, the cheer and the joy came to me. So I was sitting on the top of my car singing for a while and praying and praising God, and then the AAA guy came, and I jumped into the cab and chatted him up, and we had a great evening of it. And even when he handed me the bill, that big gouge of money out of my budget that I really didn't have because I wasn't working for money, I was interning, even that moment I was able to say, it's just money. I'm going to play at it. And I got through that evening much better than I would have if I hadn't played at it. I'm really grateful to Charlie for teaching me that. So let's talk a little more about expanding capacity. Let's talk about expanding our capacity for joy by thinking about expanding our capacity for food. Now, we all know that when someone experiences starvation, they are refed very gradually, because if you refeed them too quickly, they can have organ shutdown. So what they're going through is a process of re-expanding their stomach capacity. Well, I went through something like this at a certain stage in my life when I had developed an eating disorder. And my stomach, as a result of the eating disorder, had shrunk. By the grace of God, people were able to get through to me, and God was able to get through to me, and I recovered from the eating disorder. Actually, what happened was I got a wake-up call, and I couldn't eat for a solid week because I got a flu, and I went down to 85 pounds. That's a death's doorstep kind of weight. It's about 20 pounds off of me, and I'm not a big person. And so it was a wake-up call for me, and I realized I can't play with this anymore. I've got to start gaining some weight. And so that was my wake-up call, that I needed to pivot out of that ridiculous mindset. And I gradually started expanding the capacity of my stomach. But I remember starting to eat normally and how strange it felt to me. It was almost as difficult for me to eat normally, I would think, than it is for a person who is trying to eat less because they're trying to diet. So I really had to make an effort to eat normally because I was expanding my capacity. Fortunately, a couple of years later, I was able to really expand my capacity in a different organ in my belly, and that was my uterus. And I got pregnant and was able to bring 2 healthy children into the world because I myself was well nourished. So it really served me well to expand my capacity. But I want to talk to you about how we can expand that capacity through something called active acceptance. Active acceptance. This has been studied broadly in social science as a really healthy, helpful coping technique. So let's look at what active acceptance is by looking first at what it isn't. Okay, so the first kind of sort of version of this is non-acceptance. Non-acceptance says things like, something bad happened that never should have happened, and I'll protest it by never accepting it. Have you been someone, or have you known someone that looks at a major life disappointment over and over again and can never seem to let go of it, can never seem to move on from it? That would be non-acceptance. Then there's resignation, and this is not really what I'm looking for either. Resignation says, something bad happened and I can't do anything about it, sigh, it's hopeless. That's something that we call learned helplessness, where people try and try again to impact the world around them, and being unsuccessful, they come to the conclusion that nothing will ever change around them. They have no power. no ability, no agency. They cannot impact the world around them. Those people will start to cherish this idea that they are completely helpless. That's not what we're looking for either. What we're looking for is active acceptance. Notice the active in that phrase. Active acceptance says, something happened which I don't like, but I don't expect a life without sorrow. What can I do next? Notice how non-acceptance is past focused and active acceptance is future focused. Which of looking at the past or the future would give you more of a sense of empowerment, at least potentially? Well, looking at the future, because you can't change the past. You know, so often as human beings, we fall into patterns of dwelling on things that we cannot change. That's why the beautiful prayer, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We human beings have a tendency to just continually revert to focusing on things we cannot change. And what that does is raises our frustration level, because we are created by God for power. He said, have dominion. Now, it is true that we have no power without him. Jesus said, without me, you can do nothing. But we are created for that power, and Jesus can now flow that power into our lives and sort of re-empower us, really. So if we're in a constant state of powerlessness, we're going to be frustrated because we're trying to function outside of our original design. And so we're going to raise our frustration level through this. Now, the two things that people typically focus on that raise their frustration level in this way are the past, but also other people. We can't choose for other people. So if we continually focus on all the things other people are doing that bother us, basically what we're doing there is we're raising our frustration level because we're not in the citadel of their soul, capable of choosing for them. So let's refocus on what we can change. And the fact is that God has created us with agency and volition, and we can move into the future volitionally, and we can make choices that can shape our future in a much more healthy way. Now, I see much biblical support for this concept of active acceptance. Here's Paul speaking. He says, I know how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Listen to the active acceptance in that passage. He's just so empowered, and yet he's not trying to change things that he cannot change. We also see this active acceptance in the experience of Job. I mean, this dude experienced major life disappointments, like everything at once that was of benefit to him and that he loved and enjoyed was taken from him in a matter of a few short days. What a devastated individual he was. And yet, after a process of grieving and a struggle, he was able to say, shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? Now, he wasn't saying that God made all those bad things happen to him. In fact, you see right in the book of Job, God sort of draws the curtain, and we can see that it was actually the devil that was bringing that adversity. But because God permitted it, Job spoke as if God actually did it. And he said, you know, I'm not going to hold it against God that he allowed the enemy to do this to me. I have learned how to do that myself. I have learned, or I should say am learning, how not to complain, not to hold it against God, and not to take it as him not loving me and cherishing me when he allows the enemy to bring adversity. Now, someone's going to push back on this and say, well, this acceptance thing, that's just denial of how terrible life can be and of the awful things that I've been through and the traumas that I've been through. And I do want to say that I believe in counseling and in working with people, empathy always comes first. And so I'm not saying the things I'm saying because we just need to like pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and just get a life and just move on and stop complaining. I'm not that kind of person, or try not to be. But let me just help you understand that acceptance is not denial. In fact, acceptance is part of true grieving. And when we encounter a major life disappointment, such as the ones I've been sharing with you, there is going to be a period of intense grieving. Now, grieving is something that never really ends. I've talked to my friend Pat, who lost her husband and two children, and she tells me that she goes through the grief cycles over and over in her life, and that she never loses that sense of loss. But there was an intense period of grieving directly after the disaster that she had to experience before she could get up and move on in life. And that's the nature of grieving. There's an intense period. And then, this side of eternity, we will always mourn those losses. I had a terrible accident with my little dog, Freddie, a couple of 3 years ago. I still cry about it sometimes. I still feel the pain of losing my precious little dog. He was the best dog I ever had. So I'm not discluding or disallowing true grieving. Acceptance, however, is part of true grieving. You can still feel sad about a loss and yet accept it. There was a wonderful researcher named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a wonderful psychologist. And this woman sort of framed out the process of grieving in 5 simple steps. And I don't think anyone has improved on this. It's very, very accurate. So the first thing we do when we're grieving a loss is denial. Oh, this isn't really happening. Let me just, that feeling of maybe I'll wake up, maybe this is just a dream, or maybe there's something I can do to change this. This can't be this bad. Denial is a very common initial reaction to a major life disappointment or a loss or a trauma. Then the next step is typically anger, like, why did you let this happen, God? That frustration, that, questioning of God and his character, or questioning of people around us. And then bargaining. Often we try to bargain with God. Well, God, if I'm just super obedient, or if I just do these things, will you please make this go away? And then after bargaining, depression, where you finally realize you're helpless and you can't change the outcome. And your nervous system just kind of goes flat. And then finally, acceptance. Now, we need to realize that grief is not a one-time thing. It's not linear, it's cyclical. So people will go through, if grieving is done properly, an intense period of grieving. And that cycle will probably continue in their life past that point of intense grieving as well. And they'll go through these stages. They don't necessarily get finished, and then you move on to the next one. But these are very powerful stages, and they end with acceptance. Acceptance is a very important part of thriving in what is a very disappointing world. So that's what I call growth mindset, or it's part of what I call growth mindset. So growth mindset says the purpose of life is growth. Joy is a byproduct. If we set as our purpose in life, as our goal, to have uninterrupted happiness, pleasure, prosperity, good things in this temporal realm, we are setting ourselves up for disappointment. And ultimately, that goal will lead us away from Jesus. But if we will set as our purpose in life to grow from whatever happens, be it good or bad, we will succeed and thrive and flourish. And this is because God has not promised to give us uninterrupted happiness, pleasure, and prosperity. In fact, he's promised the opposite. He said, in this world, you will have tribulation. But then he said, be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So if we set as our purpose that happiness, we're going to be disappointed. But if we set growth, you know what? God has promised that. He said, he that has begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. God is good, and he will grow us. Okay, so let's look at a little diagram of this. We're following Jesus, and if we have set as our purpose to be uninterruptedly happy, eventually that path will deviate from following Jesus. It will pull us away from him. If, however, we set as our goal to grow, which God has promised, we will track with Jesus because that is his plan for us. And joy will be a byproduct of that because we will have expanded the contexts in which we can experience positive emotion even in the midst of negative circumstances. You know, my husband has a plaque. It says, you can only be young once, but you can be immature forever. And it's a joke, but it actually brings up a good point. why should we grow? What's the point of growing? What do we get out of it? You know, what's the meaning of growth? You just grow to grow so you can be like a really wise, mature person and then you die? Is that the purpose of growth? Is that the meaning of growth? Why should we grow? I want to, in order to answer that question, I want to put us in a cosmic context. I want us to look at the big picture, because the reality is, looking at God's storyline, looking at the big picture of the universe and the history of the universe, we can see much more meaning in our little lives down here on earth. So I want to do that for a moment here by looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 9. It says, we have been made a spectacle to the world, both to angels and to men. That word spectacle is from the Greek theatron, and that sounds like our word theater. So apparently we're like on stage and the angels and the men are watching. Why is this? Why are they watching us? Well, if you roll back and remember the story of God and how Lucifer rebelled and how a third of the angels rebelled with him. We see that in Revelation 12, and how he was cast down to earth and how he led humanity then into sin and how Jesus came and died on a cross to save humanity. If you remember God's history, you see why we are being watched by angels and men. It's because we were created to be like him. We were created in his image to demonstrate his character in kind of the courtroom of the universe. And that really gives life a lot of meaning, doesn't it? So that's a good reason to grow, because I can reflect his character more and God can get done what he needs to get done in the universe. Also, we see in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 10 that God should be made known through the church to the principalities and powers in heaven. Notice it's through the church, and the church is comprised of what? Martians? Dogs and cats? No, the church is comprised of people. So God is made known through people to principalities and powers, which are angels. God is made known through people to angels in heaven. We are actually demonstrating the character of God to the angels in heaven. And to me, that is a very inspiring and beautiful thought. So I think it benefits us to reframe everything that we experience in life as growth. You know, I may not like it when it's happening. It may be a real bummer. I may be losing something that I valued intensely. It may be a major life disappointment for me. It may be something I have to grieve in my humanity that will bring me great pain and suffering. But if I can reframe it as an opportunity to grow in compassion and love and better reflect the character of God to the universe and to human beings, it changes everything. You know, Nietzsche said that a man that has a why to live can bear up almost under any how. If we have a reason, meaning that comes out of these negative experiences, we can deal with them more effectively. Jesus said as much. He said, "Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake." I would call that a major life disappointment when people are turning on you and hating on you. But what did he say? He didn't say be bummed out and depressed about it. This is a terrible experience. He said rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. In other words, reframe this negative experience and you will experience joy. You will be expanding your capacity for joy, and you will experience joy in the midst of difficulty. You know, Paul said that he wanted, above all, to know Jesus and the power of his resurrection. Now that sounds so good, knowing Jesus and the power of his resurrection. Wow, it sounds so powerful, and I love to have power. We all love power, and that's cool. But then he goes on and he says, and the fellowship of his sufferings, being made conformed to his death. Well, that doesn't sound fun at all. That doesn't sound happy at all. Fellowship of sufferings, conformed to his death. What Paul was saying was that he would rather be intimate with God in suffering than be separated from God and have uninterrupted freedom from suffering. And that's where I want God to get me, because love is ultimately what really matters. I want to grow and develop in love. I want to shine out God's character of love to human beings and to angels, because that's the greatest fulfillment of my life here on earth, and that's what God created me for. So I want to share with you in closing a poem that I wrote. It's actually a children's song, but it sort of drives home the point that Paul made in that last verse. Last night, I had the strangest dream. An angel carried me to heaven's gate. Glory flowed out, a golden stream. The angel said, "Come right in, celebrate." But then the angel asked me, what if Jesus wasn't there? What if he was still out on the cross somewhere? What would you say? What would you do? Go in and wait for him in heaven? Or is Jesus heaven to you? I woke, my pillow wet with tears. Oh, so happy that it wasn't real. Still how that dream, so filled with fears, changed the way I think and feel. All of us should ask what we're really longing for, special things for us or the honor of the Lord. What would you say? What would you do? Go in and wait for him in heaven, or is Jesus heaven to you? Now, obviously, we're not going to get to the gate of heaven, and Jesus is still on a cross. It's not going to happen. It's not going to go that way. Praise God. I want his suffering to end as well. But what if it did? Where would we go? Would we go to him out of love, or would we want uninterrupted happiness? I would suggest that what God is leading us to is that place of pure love that would rather be with Jesus in suffering and with him in his struggle than be separated from him and have uninterrupted happiness. And that isn't even really a feasibility anyway in this broken world. In so doing, we will increase our capacity for joy. And the paradox of that is the more we make choices out of love, even choices to enter into the suffering of Jesus and others out of love, the more joy we have. So may God help you to fill in the gaps of what I've shared, and I pray that you are helped and blessed. Oh, and I have one little follow-through, one little action step for you. Try being joyful in the midst of a bad experience. Play at it. Start with something small that isn't too catastrophic, and see how you feel, just completely flipping it into something positive. Okay, I'll see you in part 5. God bless.